Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for attending this presentation of Understanding and Preventing Workplace Violence. This is a special presentation for executives and senior leaders. Certainly, we recognize that the concerns that leaders have around this issue can be different than others in the organization. So we're going to be working through a very straightforward curriculum this morning, 5 quick sessions that does wrap up, as we mentioned a moment ago, with the idea of consequence management and talking about even after the fact, if there is some sort of potential violence in the organization or affecting our personnel. But as we do so, we're going to move through some of those very specific concerns for leaders, the types and sources of workplace violence. We're all looking at the issue of workplace violence through a similar lens, talk about prevention, and then actually safety and survival. And the reason we're going to focus on that is because that is an element that will actually be in all of the other training, meaning that the module that's developed for mid-level managers and the module that's developed for all staff will have that component. And I want you, please, to be familiar with what we're sharing with people during those programs as well. So let's talk a little bit about the executive concerns. Obviously, even in just presenting this program, demonstrates that your organization has taken a very, very important leap forward in identifying what is a significant risk in the modern workplace. Our goal in our program today is, of course, safety and security, but also to help address liability that we know that we can defend, stand up and explain to someone, explain to the courts, our program, our approach, what your organization has done to take reasonable steps to reduce the likelihood of the severity of this sort of situation. Because when we do end up in that courtroom situation, and it's a tragic thing to say, and it sounds a little bit cold to say this, but when we talk about things like workplace violence and active shooter situations, every bullet comes with a lawyer attached. Even if no one is hurt, you should anticipate civil suits for your organization in terms of people who feel that they were traumatized or exposed to this threat, even if it does have a good outcome and no one, as I said, is hurt. So the program, again, the questions in the courtroom are, did we know or should we have known about this problem and about a potential perpetrator? Did we do our best to conform with current best practices in preparing for the organization? Now, when we think about any kind of workplace violence, an active shooter for us is going to be one form of workplace violence. It's actually going to be the most rare but most devastating form of workplace violence. And we're going to prepare for all forms, including active shooter, because we know that any violence, even at its lowest level, can erode morale, team cohesion, retention, recruitment. It can impact your reputation and your brand. It could be devastating in so many ways, never mind, obviously, the human cost of some sort of violence and the toll it may take. Every organization has this vulnerability. This is not a situation in which any organization can feel they're immune. And certainly it puts us all at a greater risk when someone has the thought that this somehow could never happen here, never happen to our organization. Now, someone who's worked for the last 32 years in this area, I could tell you there are very few types of emergencies that actually can be more devastating to an organization than workplace violence. So it is a very serious problem, as we all understand. And it's one that requires very focused attention from everyone, including our leadership. So we know this for the last 2 years, you've seen a slow and steady increase right alongside all the stories about COVID-19, about an increase. And we have had a significant increase, for example, in workplace violence and especially active shooters over the last 2 years. In fact, the most recent FBI statistics were just released about 2 weeks ago. They showed a 98% increase in 2021 over 2019. So this problem did not slow down during the pandemic. It actually picked up in some very significant ways. And we talk about workplace violence. Right now, it's the third leading cause of death on the job in the US, and it is the leading cause of death for women in the workplace. When we think about where we are now, it becomes important not just to be thinking about what we knew and we understood for the last decades about workplace violence, to really have a very clear-eyed views about what that looks like right now in this moment. And as I said, the most recent FBI statistics are very illuminating and a little bit shocking, as well as we see these significant decreases that have been going on for more than a decade, but very clearly an upward trend in violence in our society in all its different forms and in workplace violence and active shooter situations as well. So the time is right important for us to get our arms around a problem like workplace violence and active shooter. We are still averaging about 11 people killed each workday, each work week in the US, about 2 each day, with more than 500,000 cases of workplace violence reported in North America each year. And as I said, one of the leading causes of death on the job. The cost is tremendous to the organization. And as I say, at the top of this list, always the cost is the humanitarian impact, the different sort of, really human effects that this has on everyone, our employees, their families, our customers, everyone we're associated with. When we have an instance of violence, even if it's not gun violence, it can result in the loss, perhaps, of a very, very skilled and talented employees that we'd like to keep in our ranks, the psychological damage, property damage, and of course, the trickle down in terms of productivity and the attention our management needs to give to the problem that could take away from other issues. Could also relate to increased security costs, workers' comp costs, and other personnel costs. The costs are sweeping. In fact, in the US, we think that workplace violence costs employers about $121 billion each year. And a lot of that is in workers' comp, a lot of that is in lost wages, but we know when there are civil suits, and there are likely to be civil suits in the wake of any violence, the average settlement is $500,000 and the average jury award is about $3 million. So these are incredibly costly, as I said, on top of the obvious human suffering that's involved in any sort of violence. Now, most of us are familiar with OSHA, and you might be familiar with certainly Cal OSHA and other local standards as well. But in OSHA's thinking, workplace violence is a foreseeable risk. And when we think about the general duty clause from OSHA that employers have an obligation to provide employees with a safe and healthy workplace, we understand that there's a general duty to help recognize those hazards, and this is a foreseeable hazard, and help mitigate those. And that means to us, reduce the likelihood and reduce the severity of these events. This is considered part of our duty of care. Now, the other thing to know about as an executive or a leader is there is actually a national standard around workplace violence beyond what is articulated by OSHA. This was created by ASIS International, the American Society for Industrial Security, and SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management, first in 2011, revised in 2020 to include an active shooter annex. But essentially, in large print here, all organizations, regardless of their type, carry a responsibility for both humanitarian and legal reasons to protect employees and others to the fullest practical extent. We know we cannot stop all violence, but can we make every reasonable attempt to identify and stop that violence before it affects us? That is something we think is doable. So there is actually a national standard around this. And the first question that comes up in the wake of any sort of violence, did your organization know about this standard? And show us how you complied with this standard. So in this way, we understand that there are all these considerations that are touched on in these national standards. They have to do with OSHA's general duty clause. They have to do with this national standard, which I said is an ANSI, American National Standards Institute standard for workplace violence prevention and intervention. But other concerns for you, negligent hiring. Let me give you a very quick example of that. It's a classic example, and I'm not talking out of school. This is well publicized. Years ago, Maytag, and you may remember the commercials of the lonely Maytag appliance repairman. Maytag hires an individual, a man who's recently out of prison. And that's not the problem. You know, in many states and jurisdictions, there's a requirement to give folks like that an equal chance to try to re-enter the workforce. But they hired this individual to be a home appliance repair person, knowing that he had been incarcerated for a long stay due to sexual assault. They hired him in a position where I knew he would likely to be home alone with people, many vulnerable people. And sure enough, this becomes a well-known legal case because he goes forward and commits another sexual assault in a home while he's repairing an appliance. So coming back to the question, did you know or should you have known about these risks? This was an act of negligent hiring. Not that they hired someone with a record, they hired someone for that position with that specific sort of record. So there is the idea of negligent hiring. Negligent supervision is the idea that we hear and see problems in the workplace that speak to about risk and they're not appropriately dealt with. We brush them under the rug. We don't take them seriously. We're negligent in addressing those while the person is in our employment, or we have other issues not to deal with an employee. And negligent retention is we've kept someone, perhaps hired and kept someone much longer than we should have when we knew this person represented a risk potentially of violence. Let me give you a heads up on this. We should never keep an employee out of fear. And sometimes employers do say, you know what, we're worried about this person becoming violent, but we're more worried that they become violent if they're terminated. So we should keep them around to keep people safe. That never flies. If you have such a concern that someone may be violent, that's not a reason to keep them around either longer. You need to develop a different strategy to handle that risk. There's ADA and EEOC sorts of considerations about different emotional and physical conditions that may increase certain types of concerning behavior. But even under ADA and even under HIPAA rules, there are exemptions for dangerousness when we see any sort of dangerous behavior. So we never look at those as absolute blankets to say, like, we can't touch this situation or we can't address our concerns about a dangerous person because of ADA, HIPAA, or other sorts of employment sorts of regulations. We also have to be concerned ourselves about workers' comp and wrongful death or wrongful injury suits and other sorts of litigation as well. There's a wide range of different problems. Joseph asks a question, can you find out why a person is in prison? And very often through investigations, you can. You could just go back to the public records. You could see why someone was arrested, why someone was on trial very often. You very often can find documentation in newspapers and court records that are open source that talk about the why. So there are some places, you're right, Joseph, that we do have to be sensitive in where we dig. We don't want to create additional problems and hardships in stepping over the line, but there are many times where these records are available to open sources. It's a good reason to work with your security team. It's a good reason to work with sometimes private investigators when we need to, who could stay within legal bounds and still help obtain some of that information that's useful. When we think about the national standard articulates for us the elements of a workplace violence program. A workplace violence plan typically is that thing we build in a binder and put on the shelf. A workplace violence program is active 24/7, 365. It means anytime, day or night, someone could call a helpline, a hotline, the security office, leave a voicemail about a concern. We know that we need to be on this all the time. So a program is something a little more comprehensive and includes elements of what we're doing today, which is training, the development of our threat assessment team we've done back a month or two ago. These sort of elements, which include, as I said, what's obvious from everyone from Doran down, is management's commitment and our involvement of individuals in this process. The risk evaluation is how John and I spent some time looking at the nature of your work, the nature of your company, the relationship with contractors and others to get a sense of your violence risk, and then talk about what controls are in place. But recently, your policy has been tightened up a little bit around this, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. And we're on our way to more employee training. And beyond this, we're going to formalize record keeping around threats and violence, and to talk about program evaluation, to know that this program is actually having the desired impact. But as I said, key expectations is that everybody's on board, because that one employee who doesn't get the memo on this, they become the weakest link when there is some sort of problem. So everyone needs to know about how they recognize and report a concern, what to do if there's a dangerous situation. We all need to be on the same page. This also means having direct access to those threat assessors in your teams so that we can, in a very quick and timely way, address problems as they arise. We're talking about education. We're talking about education that's been customized for different groups like yourself today. And we're hoping that you, as leaders in the organization, actually can model and help shape a culture that has no tolerance for violence. Now, you've heard that expression before, no tolerance and zero tolerance. Zero tolerance does not mean mandatory sentencing, that every time someone does or says something, there's an automatic response. The only automatic response that's expected is that you investigate it. You look more deeply and come to understand the problem, and then make a proportional and appropriate response to it depending on your level of concern. Zero tolerance in its best form means we never ignore a concern or threat, but it does not mean we always have a standardized response where every situation is dealt exactly in the same way. The correct response, the thoughtful response, is one that takes into account the context and the situation and then develops the appropriate proportional response. Now, when we think about how we develop programs, programs are typically multi-layered and multi-phased, and you're part of this right now in the different phases that we're rolling out. The multi-layer means that we have a system in place for addressing physical security. You have John in your security office. You have people who are looking at this and talking about this. Background checks done properly for new hires, and employee involvement with all parts of the workplace violence program, understanding it, being willing to report, understanding how to make themselves safe during a hostile encounter are all important elements. Now, you have to have the kind of proper lens for us to understand what we mean by workplace violence in this context. OSHA, again, talks about a range of behavior. It is not just physical assault, and it certainly is not just weapons involved, especially